kind. Thank you very much. My marketing department would be so proud of you. So our goal today is to discuss the legal issues that really matter to media companies in 2019. And you might ask, why did we pick this topic? And one answer is, we think it's really interesting and you'll like it. We hope you agree with us. But the second issue, or the second reason we wanted to do it was this issue, this discussion that we're about to have, this conversation, is really important to the First Amendment Advisory Council and also to the Media Institute as a whole as we figure out what issues to get involved in, what coalitions to join, what coalitions to drive, where should we be putting our energy and efforts. And it's best to talk to people on the front lines about what's actually happening and what people find really important. And so that's why we're doing this. And on a personal note, let me just say, I apologize for the appearance. My eye doctor did volunteer to give me a wooden parrot that I could use to complete the ensemble. I thought I'd decline on that. So we've got a great panel for you today. A few interesting facts about our panelists. 3 have worked for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. 2 have worked for the Washington Post. 3 have worked in the media, 2 as reporters, and 1 as a radio talk show host. 3 have taught media law courses, and they're all fantastic lawyers. In a competitive world, these 4 are the best of the best. I'm just going to start and go down the road. Ashley Messenger is Senior Associate General Counsel at NPR, specializing in First Amendment and media law. She's also a member of the First Amendment Advisory Council here at the Media Institute. She previously worked as editorial counsel at U.S. News and World Report and as the McCormick Tribune Fellow at the Reporters Committee and as Director of Business and Legal Affairs for New City Publications. She has taught First Amendment law at the University of Michigan Law School and media law courses at American University, George Washington University, and George Mason University. She's also the author of an excellent and widely adopted textbook, A Practical Guide to Media Law. Earlier in her career, she was a commercial radio talk show host and writer. Jim McLaughlin is Deputy General Counsel of the Washington Post, where he is responsible for newsroom-related legal issues and litigation. And if that weren't enough, Jim is also the Post's Director of Government Affairs. His work at the Post includes pre-publication review, defense of actual or threatened libel claims, news gathering advice, First Amendment issues, subpoenas, and FOIA. But as you'll find out in this conversation, many more issues. Now, before joining the Post in 2006, he worked at the notable law firm Covington & Burling, but also Zuckerman Spader, also known. Like Ashley, he was the McCormick Tribune Legal Fellow at the Reporters Committee, and he clerked for Judge Sirica at the Third Circuit. He's on several boards and is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Next to Jim is Bruce Brown. He's Executive Director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and has led that organization since 2012. When Bruce graduated from law school, he was a reporter for 2 years at the Washington Post and the Legal Times. He then went into private practice, becoming a partner in the Washington office of Baker Hostetler, where he represented a wide array of media companies. He's a former lecturer at the University of Virginia Law School and co-directed the First Amendment Clinic there for several years. He's also a former adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University's master's degree program in journalism. And finally, Tom Curley, at the end, is Associate General Counsel at Gannett, with responsibility for advising journalists with respect to libel, access, intellectual property, and First Amendment matters. Tom also helps manage all of Gannett's content-related litigation. Tom began his career as a reporter for the News Journal in Wilmington, Delaware. He later covered national news as a reporter for USA Today. Tom left USA Today to attend law school at Georgetown, thinking he would return to journalism and cover politics or the courts. Instead, he joined the Levine Sullivan media law firm after graduation. In his 15 years at that firm, Tom's work involved defending the media in litigation involving copyright infringement, defamation claims, subpoenas to reporters, and access to courts and government records. So let me start with a premise. And the premise is that the legal issues that matter to the media have undergone a tectonic shift. When I began as a media lawyer back in the days of typewriters and smoke-filled newsrooms, literally, defamation litigation and keeping reporters out of prison for protecting confidential sources were among the most important issues to the industry. The defense bar was called the Libel Defense Resource Center, now renamed the Media Law Resource Center. And the Reporters Committee had been launched to help protect journalist freedom. Fast forward to 2019, and we have a dramatically diverse legal landscape for media companies. We'll be discussing many of those topics in the next hour, and please have questions in mind, because we'll save plenty of time at the end for you to speak with our panelists. So let me start with some digital media issues. And first to Jim, one issue that's new to publishers in this area is disclosure of the source of political and controversial issue advertising. Our friends in the broadcasting industry, many of whom are in this room, have had that, many decades of experience with that because it's in the Communications Act. And now there's this effort to sort of move that to the online media through the Honest Ads Act and other legislation, which will increase the burden on digital platforms. Can you give us your sense of how you're dealing with that, how you dealt with it in the past, what you think the threats are in terms of the First Amendment?
Sure. Well, we're dealing with it. First of all, there are a few state laws that are actually already in place. So, can you hear me? Okay. We are challenging a Maryland statute currently in court with a number of other Maryland publishers. And the Maryland case is actually very interesting because it's a federal court case. It raises a lot of the same issues that are going to come up in the debate over the Federal Honest Ads Act, and we want a good result in the Maryland case, so we can use that on the Hill. The basic concern we have is that a number of these proposals, including the Honest Ads Act and the Maryland statute, affirmatively require publishers to disclose information about the identity and a number of other categories of information of their political advertisers. And they do it by requiring publishers to post a report, make available for public inspection, according to the Maryland statute. And as First Amendment lawyers know, a compulsion by the government for any private speaker to publish something is a cause for concern. It's not just a media issue. It's compelled speech. So we actually won our test case in federal court in Maryland on the compelled speech argument primarily, and avoided that statute. And we took quite a bit of sort of PR beating in that case because the Maryland law was a reaction to Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Of course, every politician wants to be seen to be doing something about that, and most politicians do. And it's kind of not a very comfortable place to be seeking to invalidate a law that on its face is designed to increase disclosure in political advertising context and prevent interference in our elections. But I think the argument that we'll carry the day for us in the Maryland case, and it's an argument we'll make in the federal debate as well, is there really isn't any documented problem with newspaper websites or news organization websites running ads that are actually Russian plants. The meddling in the 2016 election was mostly propagation of fake news on Facebook for free. There were other aspects of it too, but the Russians weren't buying ads in the Washington Post and New York Times. We actually said, point out one problem ad that you think the Post ran in 2016 to the Maryland Board of Elections, and they couldn't. We have pretty strict standards about accepting political ads. We know who we're dealing with. The ads themselves have disclosures. So it's nobody wants to be seen to be opposed to these well-intentioned requirements, but I think this debate's going to happen again.
And being opposed to a well-intentioned requirement seems to be a recurring theme in First Amendment law. It always happens. Let me also ask Tom, part of the dark side of the internet is the way it can be used to harass and intimidate anyone, and of course that would include reporters. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about doxing, what it is, how it's been used to intimidate reporters, what other issues you see about the misuse of online platforms to really try to influence reporters to stop looking at certain issues.
Yeah, I would say so. And I was a newspaper reporter, and it was a newspaper. I wouldn't say the journalists were actually beloved at that time either. People were not cheering as they came down the street or into the city council meeting. But Very different and far more toxic situation now in light of the internet and the ability to, dox, which I think is just a fancy way of digging up everything they can find about you on the internet and publishing it. Usually it's a home address with the names of your children or something like that, with something that's written that suggests you should go and either visit the home or the children, but doesn't quite come out and say it. So that precludes probably the police getting involved. But I will say, sadly, in the run-up to the last election, I didn't go more than 2 or 3 days without a call from a reporter at one of Gannett's 100 local media properties or USA Today who wasn't having an experience where they were getting threats, via one of the social platforms, and were trying to figure out what to do about it, to assess it, to determine whether they should be worried, whether we needed more security at our buildings, and how they were going to need to do their job. And none of them turned out to have an unhappy ending. No one followed through on anything to the extent that there was even an implication that they were going to do something. But in light of particularly what happened in Annapolis and at other places, it's very sobering and in quite a different situation these days. Again, using the medium of the internet has just changed the calculus in so many ways for us.
Yeah. Anybody else want to jump in on that one? Wimmer?
Yeah, I'll just add that we've had reporters not just threatened online, but actual physical incidents. And in some cases, it's gotten to the point where we called law enforcement and brought in the FBI. And it's a tough judgment call to make because there's a whole gamut of possible threats from, I hope you burn in hell, which is probably not a legitimate threat, to I'm going to hunt you down and kill you when I know where you live. When it's more toward the latter end of the spectrum, we bring in law enforcement.
Yeah.
I would add that, just to reiterate what Jim said, it's a real concern, and it does range from I hate you, which is big, to we actually had 2 journalists killed in Afghanistan a couple of years ago. And having your journalist killed, murdered, like just flat out murdered, is an awful experience. And there are people who want to kill journalists, and I think we take for granted that, we have the First Amendment, everybody loves and supports free speech. And actually, a lot of people really don't love and support free speech at all.
Yeah.
And we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Why don't we stick with that topic for just a minute? I was going to come back to it later, but the issue of security of journalists, even in physical space, I mean, it was less than a year ago we had the shooting in Annapolis that claimed the lives of 5 journalists. And of course, you had the Jamal Khashoggi death, which was tragic and horrid, and you've done a fantastic job in keeping public awareness on that. Obviously, we have freelancers in places like Syria. Austin ICE is still at risk. How do you go about protecting journalists in physical spaces? I mean, is that something that you've all given some thought to?
Yeah, we have security companies that we work with, and it's traditionally been more of an overseas thing. If you're being sent to a risky area, we've always had training for how to handle yourself and that sort of thing. To me, the thing that's changed in the last few years is domestic threats and just this atmosphere of intimidation of journalists at political events and rallies. And the Annapolis Capital Gazette was the worst of those situations, but there have been others as well. It's very frightening. And we do have domestic security.
Yeah. And Tom, I know you've got almost 100 newsrooms to worry about in your world. How do you deal with protecting the security of people across that wide array of facilities, and how do you go about that?
It's very difficult, and there is a real limit to what you can do, because being a reporter means you are out in the community by definition, right? So, but it's the same thing that Jim said. It's not that the issue is new or that there are not experts and security consultants you can rely upon. It's just, it used to be you knew you better have a game plan when you were sending somebody to Afghanistan. It's, somewhat unfortunate that you better have a game plan going into a contested election in a lot of places in the United States and tread more carefully. At the end of the day, what you really need to do is find people who are experts in assessing those threats, whether it's local law enforcement, which sometimes can be helpful for us, and again, it's usually at a local level rather than the FBI, for example, and see what they have to say. And when in doubt, err on the side of caution and security. So, but it is interesting to be confronting these. And I will say, you do see a ramp up toward the election, and then it does die down again. I probably haven't had more than a couple of these since the election. So there's a rhythm to it, but it is scary.
Yeah. And maybe we should move to the next topic, which is just what I'm. Oh, please do. Please do.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. It just occurred to me, Kurt, that it's hard. Not to mention as a media lawyer today, that one of the constituencies you have to be thinking about in ways you never perhaps did was just the general public. And Reporters Committee is almost 50 years old. For the first time, we're launching a public messaging campaign this year around press freedom. The Washington Post had an amazing ad in the Super Bowl. I think that reflects the era we're in. The Post ran a full-page ad for us last week. At a place like RCFP, you did your cases, you occasionally did a press release. You really weren't thinking that much about audiences beyond groups like this, or judges, or people in the legislatures, lawyers at firms. But now I think we all feel that part of our jobs in this climate has to be engaging with the public on the importance of press freedom issues generally.
That's a great point, and it's a great segue to the next topic, which is how do you deal with, being continually portrayed as the enemy of the people? I mean, how has this changed the dynamics of what you do every day? Bruce, you may want to take the first crack at that because you're kind of on the front line of that nationally.
Short anecdote. When I called after the turn of the year, Joel Simon, who's my colleague, is the community journalist in New York. I said, Joel, how are you? And he said, great. And then he paused and he said, terrible. And he could have flipped that maybe and started with terrible and said, great. But I think what we're all feeling is that we're exhausted and worn down because, on a daily basis, we are just dealing with a climate that's incredibly challenging for groups who do our kind of work. On the other hand, the work that we do is now more visible. And all of our organizations have seen an increase in support in the last couple of years. And that is very encouraging for us. We are, when you asked about the reporters and doxing and threats like that, one of the things that some of the press freedom groups have done in the last couple of years is combine on a tracking program that is largely run by CPJ with some help from others, where we are trying to pick up the major incidents around the country around threats to reporters and violence and protests that might be directed towards journalists. And for the first time, trying to collect that information in a systematic way. Organizations like ours, and I've got some statistics here that I can get to later just about our workload, but we never used to keep track of statistics on threats to journalists or violence to reporters at protests. And we were busy keeping stats on number of calls about libel law, number of calls about freedom of information laws around the country. And now suddenly we're all tracking a new set of data out there. And that is, without a doubt, one of the major shifts for us in the last couple of years.
Yeah. I wonder if when your clients are deciding whether to send a reporter to, say, a political rally, does the concern for their physical safety enter into whether it's really newsworthy for them to cover, or are you sort of putting them in a position of just being a prop to be taunted and reviled by the crowd? I mean, how do you get involved in any of those issues going in, or is it more we've decided we need to do this? How do we protect the reporter?
I think for us, that has not prevented us from covering anything. Marty Barron, our executive editor, feels very adamant that we're not going to make coverage decisions based on the possibility of being screamed at or taunted. It's unpleasant, obviously, for the reporters,
Right.
And we're very sensitive to safety issues. But unfortunately, it's kind of become something you sort of sign up for when we cover a presidential campaign.
Yeah.
States.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine a reporter saying, oh, I don't want to go cover that because someone's going to mock me or, make fun of me. No reporter has that in their blood. They just
Yeah.
don't. It doesn't come with the territory.
The DNA kind of works the opposite direction, right?
Exactly. Send me in.
Send me in, exactly.
Yeah, I will say the circumstances that it's never the reporter who calls me. It's always the editor who says, well, the reporter didn't want me to call you, but I'm a little,
Exactly. Well, let me just switch to a more prosaic, but obviously important practical topic, intellectual property. This is something that, 10 or 15 years ago was kind of a small sideline of what we did. Now it seems to occupy more and more of our mind space. I'd like to sort of start with Ashley. So would you envision becoming a music licensing expert, 5 years ago or 10 years ago? It's kind of extraordinary.
So ironically, I actually started my career doing music industry work. I thought I wanted to be a music lawyer, and then I realized that wasn't what I wanted to do, so I became a media lawyer, but now I'm a music lawyer again. So it all comes full circle,
Yeah.
but there are certain industries, broadcasters have always had a music component. We have the blanket licenses, especially in radio, you have a lot of stations that play music, so we've always had to deal with it. But now that everything is multi-platform, and copyright law has really not kept up with the technology, it is becoming more challenging to figure out how to accommodate all the copyright interests that go into putting things together. And that includes not only music, but also photos, as a lot of the issues around photographs, as tracking software makes it easier for people to track photographs. I mean, no news organization intentionally steals photos, but sometimes people misrepresent what they own the rights to.
Right.
And that can be a problem. So there are a lot of things we have to do to make sure that we have procedures in place so that we are compliant with all the copyright requirements, but it really has become a little overwhelming and the law has not kept up. There aren't easy, simple ways to clear rights that we need for everything that we might do necessarily.
Often, sorry to interrupt, but often it's not clear who the rights holder is.
Exactly. That's exactly one of the problems.
Yeah. And it's difficult to figure out from something that was published, say, 5 years ago, but is still on your internet site, whoever had those rights and what was actually clear, back in whatever year it was. But we mentioned the reverse search engine that makes it easier for photographers to find out who's using their images, which has kind of spawned kind of cottage industry of lawyers who work with them to then file tons of lawsuits. And I imagine that you, Jim, and Tom also have been dealing with those types of situations.
Yeah, there are certain plaintiffs' lawyers, copyright plaintiffs' lawyers that we're well acquainted with, and we get a letter. I won't mention names, but I'm sure some of them are the ones we don't know. And it's almost, I hate to say it, but at a certain point, it's a cost of doing business. I mean, we try to prevent infringements, obviously, because we do respect intellectual property, but we've got 55 different blogs, I think, and a lot more people than in the past have the authority to put up content. And sometimes, no matter how hard you try to train people on intellectual property, it's amazing how many people have a very broad view of fair use as journalists. In reality, say, isn't that a fair use?
Oh yeah, exactly.
I think the biggest problem in practice is publicists who don't understand copyright law. It's not that we don't understand copyright law. It's that someone will say, oh, you're interviewing our CEO, here's a picture of him. And we'll ask, do you own the rights to this? Is it rights cleared? Did the photographer give you consent to sublicenses to us? Oh yes, absolutely. And no, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't have the rights, and there's no way to know if they know what they're talking about. And you don't want to go around accusing everybody of being a liar and not knowing what they're talking about. And there's no easy way to remedy that. It's really, from a practical standpoint, it makes it extremely difficult to actually put a story out if you have to figure out who's the photographer, make all the phone calls. You can't rely on any representations. There's no database that you can go to find out who owns the rights.
Yeah.
It's, from a practical standpoint, really difficult.
Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, copyright is the perfect storm. So, as many of you all know, that the Copyright Act dates back to the first days of the Republic, right? And although it's been amended many times, it's a long way of saying it's perhaps not built for the digital age. And then you've got the fact that in many cases, the damages aren't what you could have licensed the photo for, $50, $1, $100, whatever it might be. It's anywhere up to $150,000. So you're gambling between 0 and 150,000, and you can guess what people usually ask for. It's not the 0. And then the last piece of the puzzle is there's no effective statute of limitations because of the case law. No one can tell where it begins and where it ends. So you've got that, all those factors at play. And so as a media company, we probably published hundreds, if not thousands, of photos while we've been sitting here today. We get claim after claim after claim of people who, say they've got a right in an image, and the cost of sorting that out can be very expensive. And a lot of the claimants and the plaintiffs' counsel who specialize in these sorts of claims just set the price tag at slightly beneath what it would cost to litigate. And if there's uncertainty about the rights, it doesn't require a legal genius to decide that it might be more cost effective to settle them, and they know that. So it's a tough spot to be in.
Definitely. And Jim, you mentioned fair use too. That seems to me to be such a dicey issue for the media because we take advantage of fair use. We obviously, on those 50 blogs that you worry about all the time, I think, there are people talking about what other people have written and quoting, at some length what they've said. And that gets into very dicey issues of how we should be using other people's content. And at the same time, in the digital world, it's so easy for bad actors to just copy all of our content and take it, and in some cases set up mirror images of our sites. And
Yeah, and with embedding, the newsrooms, I think, tend to have simple bright line rules, and so they hear embedding is okay. So,
yeah.
But then you have to look beyond that. And are you embedding an image that you know to be an infringement? And is that really okay? And I think that the legal protection around that has clearly shrunk in recent
Clearly,
years.
yes, absolutely.
So I think it's largely a matter of education for the newsrooms, but it's inevitable that you're going to get some claims in this area. Right? Sometimes you just pay them as quickly and reliably as you can.
Right. Let's talk a minute about freedom of information, which has been a perennial issue for the media, since we had the ability to request records from state and federal agencies. It's a little bit related to the enemy of the people issue, because as the Trump administration has started to shut down access to records and taken controversial actions that we'd like to explore, freedom of information, I think, has taken on a new meaning. Bruce, you've had, the Reporters Committee has always had a role in this, and back in the recession, FOIA litigation started to become one of those elective things for media companies that may not, get budget, and if budgets are tight, that might be something you cut. And, in a lot of ways, the Reporters Committee kind of stepped into that breach.
Right, and I ran some numbers before lunch today. We keep lots of metrics for our foundation funders. They want to know what we're doing
Funders are like that.
with our practice, exactly. And so it is interesting. We've seen over the last probably 10 years or so that at least half, if not slightly more, of the calls that come in from journalists to our hotline, where we have legal fellows ready to answer questions, relate to FOIA or freedom of information. And when we started and that trend has been very steady, it really has been. And when we started our litigation practice in 2014, where we began to represent reporters and news organizations directly in FOIA cases, and we now are doing those cases all around the country. Since the fall of